Welcome to another spine-chilling episode, where the bright and carefree days of summer are shadowed by unimaginable terror. Summer is often seen as a time of joy, a season for adventure, vacations, and long evenings under the golden sun. But for some, these idyllic moments take a dark and sinister turn, leaving scars that last far beyond the season. In Vacation Nightmares, 3 Scary True Stories of Summertime Dread, we will explore real-life tales of summer holidays gone wrong, stories from peaceful beaches, remote campsites, and quaint vacation spots that became the settings for unshakable fear and mystery. These are not just tales of the unknown, they are haunting reminders that danger can strike when you least expect it. Before we dive into these unsettling accounts, I want to take a moment to thank each and every one of you for being part of this growing community. Your support through likes, shares, comments, and subscriptions means the world to me and inspires me to keep uncovering these chilling stories. I hope this video finds you well and in good health, surrounded by loved ones, and I encourage you to keep your guard up, even in the most carefree moments. So grab a blanket, dim the lights, and prepare yourself for 3 unforgettable stories of summer dread. Trust me, after hearing these, you might never look at summertime the same way again. Let's begin. Story 1: The Summer Camping Incident. It started with the usual talk, the kind that young men have when they believe they are invincible, when the world beyond the safe confines of the everyday is a playground of opportunity, of untapped adventure. We were seeking something new, something beyond the usual thrill of city life, something deeper, older, a place forgotten by the world. We weren't looking for just any wilderness, but something that seemed almost forbidden, a place that whispered to us from the edges of our consciousness, a place where even the trees seemed to murmur of secrets. Chuck, Jackson, and I weren't so much friends as we were casual companions bound together by the crude camaraderie of shared boredom. We had gone on countless outings before, each time seeking the next thing, the next place to leave our mark on. But this trip, this camping excursion, would be different. It was Chuck who had first suggested the idea, as he always did, but it was I who had pushed for this specific location. It was a remote, forgotten patch of forest tucked deep in the mountains. There were rumors about it, stories whispered in hushed tones by those who had ventured near and returned with tales of strange happenings, of the air itself seeming to hum with an unnerving weight. But who listens to rumors? We dismissed them as childish fancies. We were men, and we were eager to prove ourselves in the face of the unknown. The journey itself was grueling, but we found it exciting, the kind of hardship that bonded you to the earth, made you feel part of something ancient and unyielding. We crossed streams, trudged up inclines that would have stopped most people in their tracks, and by the time we reached the campsite, night had already begun to fall, bleeding its colors over the horizon like a wound. The forest was dense here, its trees twisted into shapes that seemed unnatural, as if the very ground below was reluctant to bear their weight. The air was thick and humid, and the forest floor was soft underfoot, a sponge-like consistency that seemed to suck at our boots as we made our way deeper. The atmosphere felt oppressive, as if the forest itself was watching us, observing our every move, calculating our purpose. Still, we pressed on, eager to set up camp, to build a fire, and to settle into our primitive roles as masters of the wilderness, not realizing we were trespassers in something much larger than ourselves. The sun disappeared with unsettling swiftness, as though it had been swallowed whole by the vastness of the sky. We set up camp quickly, our words sharp, our actions brisk. The fire was lit with the usual ease of experience, but as the flames flickered to life, a strange silence seemed to descend over the area. The crackling of the fire, the rustling of leaves in the wind, the calls of distant birds, everything seemed muted, like a world muffled by a thick blanket of soundlessness. Even the trees, which had once seemed so alive with movement, now stood still, unnaturally so. I couldn't shake the sensation that something was wrong, but Chuck and Jackson, their faces lit by the fire's orange glow, were too engrossed in their plans for the night to notice. We spent the first few hours as we always did, drinking, laughing, recounting old tales, each of us pretending to be the center of attention, pretending we were invincible, that we could escape the mundanity of life through these fleeting moments of camaraderie. But as the fire dwindled, the air grew colder, the chill seeping into our bones like an invasive thought. The conversation slowed, and a strange tension settled between us, unspoken but undeniable. We all felt it, each of us glancing over our shoulders, as though the trees were suddenly not quite so benign, as though the shadows were not just the absence of light, but something more, something waiting. Jackson, ever the skeptic, tried to brush off the feeling, but I could tell he was as uneasy as the rest of us. He shifted in his seat, his eyes scanning the surrounding dark. "What do you think's out there, beyond the trees?" he asked, a nervous edge to his voice that he quickly tried to disguise with a forced laugh. "Anything dangerous, you think?" Chuck shrugged, but there was a tightness to his posture now, a subtle rigidity that hadn't been there when we first arrived. "I don't know, man. Just some wild animals, I guess. Nothing we can't handle." But his words, as much as he tried to sound nonchalant, felt like an attempt to convince himself more than anyone else. There was something out there. I could feel it. It was too still, too quiet, like the world was holding its breath. And then, just as I was about to speak, perhaps to share my own sense of discomfort, a sharp, high-pitched whistle split the air. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't even the sound of a distant bird. It was a sound too pure, too clear, too human to belong to nature. It was sharp, like a knife through the fabric of the night, and it seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. A single note, suspended in the air, and then nothing. We froze. The fire flickered in the sudden coldness that enveloped us. Jackson's hand reached for his flashlight, but he didn't dare point it into the darkness. Chuck looked at me, his face pale, his eyes wide with an unspoken question. "What was that?" Chuck whispered, his voice tight with something neither of us wanted to name. I didn't answer at first. I couldn't. My mind scrambled for a rational explanation: an animal, a bird, a trick of the wind, but nothing came. There was only the silence that followed, and the weight of something unseen pressing down on us. Another whistle came, this one slower, deliberate. It seemed to echo, as if mocking us, as if the night itself were listening to our every breath. I wanted to speak, to shout, to laugh it off, but I couldn't. The sound had pulled something out of me, something ancient, a primal fear that whispered of things too dark, too old for any of us to understand. We all looked at each other, our eyes wide with unspoken terror, and then Chuck stood up abruptly. His hand shook as he grabbed the edge of his tent, pulling it open with trembling fingers. "I'm going to check it out," he said, his voice strained. "Probably just some animal." But his voice lacked conviction, and we all knew it. We all knew that whatever was out there wasn't an animal, not in any way we could comprehend. And then came the second sound, a crack, sharp and sudden like the burst of a gunshot, but somehow wrong. It wasn't the sound of an animal moving or of the wind cracking a branch. It was something deliberate, something designed to elicit a response, to provoke fear. And that was when the first figure appeared. The shape, dark and indistinct, stood just beyond the reach of the firelight, so still it seemed almost a part of the trees themselves. The figure stood just at the edge of the clearing, its form too rigid, too unnerving to be a person. It didn't move, didn't blink. It was like a shadow, and yet there was something alive in it, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't the first one. The second came soon after, followed by another, and then another. They stood like sentinels in the dark, silent and unmoving, their faces hidden in the gloom, their bodies stiff and unnatural. I wanted to speak, to move, but I couldn't. We were paralyzed, caught in the grip of something beyond our understanding. And then came the whistle again. But this time it was different. It was closer, much closer. It came from right behind us. I don't know how we got out of there. I don't remember the details, the steps we took, the frantic scramble for our bags, for the path, for the illusion of safety. All I remember is the feeling of something watching us, something too ancient, too distant to be fully comprehended. The figures, silent and unmoving, had watched us as we fled, and the whistle followed us, its shrill note trailing behind us as we ran through the dark woods, the branches clawing at our faces, the ground beneath us shifting with a will of its own. By the time we reached the road, the sun was starting to rise, casting a pale light over the land. But I knew it was only an illusion. The forest was still there, waiting, and so were the figures. Watching, waiting for the next fools to stumble into its grasp. We never spoke of it again, not to each other, not to anyone. We went home, our minds haunted by what we had seen, what we had felt. But in the back of my mind, I knew we were not alone. And I still hear the whistle sometimes when the wind is right. Story 2: Strange Encounter at the Park. I had never thought much of the park at night. It was simply a place of silence, a space between the larger noises of life, where I could go unnoticed. People rarely ventured into the park after dark. The streets pulsed with the frenetic energy of the city, the lights blinked with a kind of artificial cheerfulness, yet the park remained stagnant, still, and unperturbed by the bustle of the outside world. Perhaps it was for this very reason that I found it so soothing, a liminal space, existing outside of time. It provided the calm I sought, a place where I could leave behind the oppressive weight of existence and become one with the silence. I had no interest in fitness for its own sake. The repetitions of exercise, the grating rhythm of muscles protesting against their own exertion, the focus on the breath, these things were not for health, for physical well-being. No, they were a kind of ritual, a movement through time meant to hollow out my thoughts, to smooth away the jagged edges of anxiety and despair. Perhaps I was fooling myself. Perhaps I was simply performing an act of self-delusion, but I had no interest in questioning it. At least not on the nights I found myself drawn to the park. The park, on these occasions, was my refuge. A place where thoughts could fade away, like mist in the early morning, and where I could forget that the world was collapsing in on itself with each passing moment. This night, however, was different. The air felt heavier, the darkness more impenetrable. It clung to me like a second skin, wrapping around me, as though it were not merely the absence of light but something tangible, something alive. The wind stirred in the trees, but there was a quality to it that unsettled me. It felt as though the wind itself were whispering, as though it were carrying words just outside my range of hearing. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and yet I dismissed it. It was nothing. I focused again on my movements. The pull-ups, the bench presses, the squats, each motion was a small act of defiance against the creeping madness of life. It was here in this repetition that I found a kind of clarity. My body ached, but the ache was familiar, grounding. I could feel the weight of my limbs, the thrum of blood in my veins, the stretch of tendons and muscles. But beneath that, something else stirred, something far more distant. A presence, as if the very fabric of the air had thickened and was now pressing against me. I forced myself to continue, to push through the fatigue, to shut out the gnawing sensation that was beginning to coil at the edges of my awareness. I could not afford to be distracted. I had come here to forget, to not think. But then, just as I was about to finish my set, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. A figure, standing at the edge of my peripheral vision. At first, I thought nothing of it. A trick of the shadows, perhaps. The park was, after all, filled with strange shapes and contours that could appear to be figures in the dark. I had seen it all before, the ghosts of my own tired mind playing tricks on me. But then the figure moved, and it was not the jerky, disjointed motion of an illusion. It was a man, a real man, though the way he moved was wrong. There was something unnatural about it, as though his body did not belong in the space it occupied. He was too still, too intent, standing a few feet away from me, gazing at me with eyes that seemed far too piercing for a man who was not known to me. I didn't want to acknowledge him. I didn't want to look at him. And yet, despite myself, my gaze drifted toward him, and in that moment the air seemed to shift, as though it were holding its breath. His presence was wrong in a way I could not explain. It was not that he was a threat, or even that he was physically imposing. No, it was something deeper, something more insidious. His body was thin, almost skeletal, draped in clothes that looked as though they had not been washed in days. His eyes, pale and unblinking, locked onto mine, and for a moment I felt as though I had been caught in a trap, a snare woven from the very fabric of the dark itself. I tried to ignore him, tried to turn my attention back to my workout, but he was there, always there, lingering just outside my awareness, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I finished my set quickly, too quickly, my movements jerky and uneven, as though I were trying to escape the invisible pressure of his gaze. Then, without any prior warning, he spoke. His voice was low, rasping, as though it had not been used in years. "I've been watching you," he said, the words hanging in the air like a weight, making the darkness feel even heavier. I froze. My mind raced to dismiss the words, to reject the very thought that someone could have been watching me for so long. It was absurd. Watching me? I had never seen this man before in my life. But he was there, standing too close now, his shadow cast over mine like a dark shroud. His eyes never left my face. "I've seen you here many times," he continued, his voice sounding almost as if he were speaking to himself. There was a strange rhythm to his words, a cadence that felt rehearsed, as though he had been saying them to himself for far longer than he should have. I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest. It was impossible. It had to be. There was no reason for him to know anything about me, and yet... "Teach me," he said suddenly, and this time there was no mistaking the command in his tone. It was not a request, not a plea, it was an order, plain and simple. Teach me. I felt a wave of unease crash over me, the air thickening, pressing down on me. Teach him? Teach him what? How to exercise? How to lift weights? The words had no meaning, no sense. They were an intrusion. His very presence, his intrusion into this space I had claimed as my own, felt like a violation. Before I could answer, before I could even process the absurdity of the situation, he spoke again, his words coming out in a breathless rasp. "I know your name, Mark," he said, and the sound of it, a name I had never shared with him, sent a chill deep into my bones. My name. My name. How could he know my name? I had never seen this man before. I had never spoken to him. The very thought that he knew me, knew something about me, filled me with an icy dread that I could not shake. It was not just a name, it was a knowing, a recognition, a connection that shouldn't have existed. I stepped back, my breath shallow, my hands trembling. It was instinct, a primal reaction to something far more disturbing than any man in the park had a right to be. Without thinking, I turned on my heel and began walking away, my steps quickening, my pulse racing, my mind screaming for release. But as I moved, I couldn't help but glance back. He was still there, standing motionless by the pull-up bar where I had just been. His body jerked and twitched in a grotesque imitation of movement, his arms straining, his face contorted in a grotesque parody of effort. It was as if he were trying to become me, to take on my shape, my movements, but in a way that was utterly unnatural, impossible. I didn't look again. I couldn't. I stumbled to my car, not daring to stop, not daring to think. I drove away as quickly as I could, but even then, the feeling didn't dissipate. I could still feel his eyes on me, his gaze embedded in my skin, following me as I drove, following me as I moved through the world, following me through the streets, through the shadows. I had left the park, but I had not truly escaped. The thing that had watched me, whatever it was still with me, a presence that had attached itself to me, followed me home, settled deep within me, like a shadow that would never leave. The park, I now realized, was never truly empty. It had always been filled with things, with watchers, with the watched. And that feeling of being watched did not fade. Not ever. Story 3: Unsettling Photos. The day after it all began, I discovered the envelope. It had appeared at my door without fanfare, without any trace of origin. There were no markings on it, no postmark, no return address, not even a name scrawled on the front. Just the blank white surface, so devoid of any distinguishing characteristics that it felt as though it had come from nowhere. From nothing. I didn't want to open it, but of course I did. Something within me compelled it, like a subconscious recognition of something I'd been avoiding. The need to understand, to break through the fragile wall of normalcy that had been shattered the night before, was overwhelming. The envelope, with its perfect blankness, seemed to demand this action, as though it were the only logical step. And so I held it in my hand. The feel of it was strange. There was an unnatural weight to it. Not heavy, but strangely dense, as though the paper itself had absorbed something dark, something not intended to be contained within its folds. I cut it open with trembling hands. The photographs slipped out onto the floor with a thin, sharp rustle, as though they, too, were hesitant to reveal themselves. 10 photographs. All of them were of me. I wanted to believe it was a prank, just some twisted joke. But deep down I knew it was something else. The photos didn't lie. They weren't doctored or altered in any way. They were raw. Unsettling. Taken without my knowledge, without my consent. The first photo was innocuous enough. It was a picture of me in my car, the sun casting strange shadows across the dashboard, my face a mask of indifference. It was just a snapshot, one of those mundane moments that pass unnoticed in the humdrum of daily life. I could almost convince myself it was taken by a passing driver. Almost. But something about it felt off. The angle was too deliberate. The focus too sharp. Someone had been watching me. Someone had been there, tracking my movements. I flipped to the next photo. It was of me at work. In the break room, leaning against the counter, a half-empty cup of coffee in my hand. I had been alone in that moment, my coworkers scattered throughout the building. It was a moment so ordinary that it barely registered when it occurred, and yet there it was captured in perfect clarity. The intrusion wasn't just physical, it was psychological too. This photo wasn't just of me, it was of me in a private space. A place where I had always felt safe. But safety had become a fragile illusion. I realized then too late that privacy was a luxury I no longer had. I turned to the next photograph, and my stomach tightened in an unpleasant twist. This one was different. Taken from a distance, it showed me walking along a street one I had never thought twice about. The familiar, quiet street where nothing ever happened. But here, captured in the frame, it seemed wrong. The world seemed wrong. The photo was too still, too empty, too deliberate in its ordinariness. The houses along the street, the pavement cracked in places, the fading street lamp at the corner, none of it was important. And yet everything was rendered with disturbing clarity. It wasn't just the fact that I was being watched that disturbed me. It was the realization that I had been being watched for a long time, longer than I could remember. I had been watched in the mundane moments that made up the quiet fabric of my days, and I hadn't even realized. The sinister nature of it all was in the subtlety. The fact that this intrusion hadn't been some grand, dramatic affair. It had been quiet, almost passive, but it was persistent. And that persistence was far more terrifying than any violent confrontation. Another photo. This one was taken inside my apartment. I could see myself sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the TV. The furniture in the room, the slightly askew cushion on the chair beside me, the book one had abandoned on the coffee table. But it was the shadow just outside the window that caught my breath. The faint outline of someone standing there, at the edge of the frame, obscured by the drawn curtain but not fully concealed. The shadow seemed to pulse with an ominous presence. It wasn't just an absence, it was a presence. One I hadn't seen, one I hadn't felt, but one that was there all the same. The next photograph almost pushed me over the edge. It was taken from a high vantage point. I recognized the building in the distance, the uneven rooftop, the way the sky was crumbling into twilight. The perspective suggested the photographer had been somewhere above me, looking down. There was no telling how long the person had been watching me from that height. But it was clear the way the photo was taken, that the photographer knew everything about my routine. They knew the precise moment to catch me when my guard would be down, when I would be most vulnerable. In the final photograph, it froze the blood in my veins. It was of me taken from behind, but this time it wasn't just an ordinary snapshot. It was of me standing at my door, just before I opened it to find the envelope lying on the ground. The photograph was framed perfectly. I could see the exact angle of my body, my hand reaching toward the doorknob. It was as though the photographer had known, somehow, that I would open the door at that very moment. I stumbled back, dropping the photographs onto the floor in a heap. I could hear my breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. It wasn't just fear, it was something much deeper, something I couldn't name but which I could feel at the core of my being. Something that moved beneath the surface of my skin, making my muscles ache, making my joints stiff. The photographs weren't just invasive, they were intimate. They weren't just snapshots of my life, they were warnings. An invitation to something dark, something inevitable, something that could no longer be ignored. Who had taken them? Who had been watching me for so long? The photographs were more than just proof of surveillance, they were a message. But the message wasn't clear. It wasn't a threat. Not in the usual sense. No, this was something else. Something worse. As I stood there trembling, I felt a sudden pressure in the air, as though the world itself were tightening around me. The walls of my apartment seemed to grow closer, the air staler. The familiar hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock on the wall, these once mundane sounds now felt intrusive, suffocating. The silence between the photos seemed to grow louder, as if the space itself had become filled with the echoes of a presence, the ghostly imprint of someone who had been there all along. The knowledge that I was being watched, that I had always been watched, settled like a stone in my stomach. It wasn't a new sensation. It was the realization of something that had been creeping at the edge of my awareness, something I had pushed aside, dismissed, and ignored. But now it was undeniable. The watcher, the presence in my life, was real. It had always been real. And yet, the true horror wasn't in the photographs. It wasn't in the idea of someone watching me. No, the true horror lay in the fact that the photographs had been taken from such an intimate distance, such calculated precision. They weren't simply of me, they were of the me that no one else saw. The me that even I had forgotten. The me that was slowly becoming a ghost, just like the presence that hovered in the background of every frame. I reached for the photographs again, my hands shaking. I needed to see them again. To find something, anything that could offer an explanation, a way out. But the more I looked, the more I realized there was no escape. No answer. No salvation. Only the growing sense that whatever had begun was already too far along. That whatever had been set into motion could not be undone. I put the photographs back into the envelope, but the presence, the weight of what I had seen, did not leave. It lingered, growing stronger with each passing minute, until the silence of my apartment was no longer comforting. It was suffocating. And so, as the evening bled into night, I sat alone in the stillness of my apartment, waiting for the next photograph, the next message to arrive. Because I knew it would. Thank you for joining me on this unsettling journey through vacation nightmares, 3 scary true stories of summertime dread. As we explored these tales, we were reminded of how the warmth and joy of summer can sometimes hide an eerie undercurrent of danger and fear. From serene beaches to quiet cabins in the woods, the places meant to offer us peace can become the backdrop for the most unexpected and chilling encounters. These stories serve as a stark reminder to always be aware, no matter how familiar or safe a setting may seem. I want to take a moment to express my deepest gratitude to each and every one of you. Your support through watching, sharing, commenting, and subscribing means the world to me. This channel thrives because of you, and it's your engagement and encouragement that inspire me to keep digging for the most spine-chilling tales to bring to life. Together, we've built a community that shares a love for the mysterious and the macabre, and I'm so grateful to have you here. As we close this chapter, I want to wish you all health, happiness, and safety. Whether you're venturing out on your own summer adventures or simply enjoying these stories from the comfort of home, always stay vigilant and trust your instincts. The line between the ordinary and the extraordinary is often thinner than we think, and sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that could happen to any of us. Thank you again for being part of this journey, and I can't wait to see you in the next video. Until then, take care of yourselves, stay curious, and as always, stay safe. See you soon.